burgerlicious definition make them boys go loco. They want my treasures so they get their pleasures from my boat. So you can see me, you can't squeeze me. I ain't.
You call me Mr. Bombastic, tell me fantastic. Touch me on me box, she says I'm Mr. Romantic.
So what's going on, guys? Today we're going to be taking a look at how to download and install VirtualBox, and we're also going to get 3 operating systems or 3 virtual machines on it. The first one being Ubuntu 18.04, second one is Windows 7 Pro, and the third one is Linux Mint 19. So I'm going to show you how to install all of these operating systems. This video should serve as a pretty good general guide on how to get going. So right now what we're going to do is we're just going to download and install VirtualBox. So to do that, just go to your favorite web browser. In this case, I'm going to be using Google Chrome, and just type in VirtualBox. And it should be the first one that comes up. I'm just going to click this download link here. And there's going to be a couple different options. Since I'm on Windows right now, I'm just going to pick the Windows host. But if you're on Linux, obviously pick a Linux distribution, or if you're on Mac OS, pick Mac. So I'm going to click Windows, and I'm just going to save this to my downloads. And once that's done downloading, we can actually launch it and get this software installed and set up. Alright, so VirtualBox has finished downloading, so let's go ahead and actually install it. I'm just going to open up this executable and click Run, and I'm going to click Next. I'm going to leave all of this default. You don't really need to change anything. You can look at these options here and see if there's anything that particularly jumps out at you. Honestly, I'm just going to uncheck all of these except the shortcut on the desktop. I do want a shortcut on my desktop. And I'm going to click Next. You can just click Yes on this warning here, and then you want to click Install. So it's going to go ahead and actually install the software at this point. Alright, so we have VirtualBox installed, and now it's open and ready to go. If it's not, just go to your desktop or wherever you saved it and launch it. But now what we're going to do is actually install a couple virtual machines, and this is the fun part. So the first thing we're going to do is install Ubuntu 18.04. I'll leave a link, by the way, to all of these ISOs in the description. But let's set up a Linux virtual machine. So to do that, we're just going to go to the top left and click New, and we're just going to specify what OS we're installing. In this case, it's Ubuntu. And as you start typing, it should actually just automatically find the correct type and version, though if it doesn't, you might have to select it from the drop-down menu. And I'm just going to click Next. And here it's basically saying, okay, how much RAM do you want to allocate to the virtual machine? It's at a default of 1 right now. I have 16 gigabytes on my actual PC. I'm just going to allocate about 4 gigabytes. Yeah, that's fine. Click Next. You can obviously decide for yourself how much RAM you want to allocate depending on what you're doing with your virtual machine. I'll leave all of that up to you guys. I'm just showing you how to set it up here. So the hard disk, yeah, basically what we're going to do is we'll just click Create on Create a Virtual Hard Disk Now. And I like to leave it on VDI and dynamically allocated for sure. You could select the fixed size, but you can't really change that later. So I'm just going to click Next. And you don't need a lot for an Ubuntu installation, so I'm just going to go with about 22 gigabytes. More or less, it's fine. I'm not even really going to use this VM. It's just sort of for demonstration purposes. So once you've decided how much space you want to allocate, just click Create. And boom, we have it. It's been created. So now that we have the virtual machine installed, what we can do is we can click this settings button here, and we can play around with some settings if we want to. This step isn't mandatory, but let's say you wanted to encrypt your disk. You can just click this disk encryption tab and select that option if you're working with like sensitive information. You can click system here, and you can change how much memory you have allocated to the virtual machine, as well as how many CPU cores. You can also change the video memory under the display tab here. So just run through this, see if there's anything that you really want to change. You can change some of this stuff later too, so it's not really a big deal. What I'm going to do is just leave everything by default. So I'm just going to cancel out of this, and I'm just going to double click this Ubuntu here. This virtual machine. So now it's going to launch, but since we haven't specified an ISO for it to read off of, or in other words, we haven't actually given it an operating system to load, it's going to want one. So in my case, it specifically found the Ubuntu 18.04, but let's assume that yours didn't. What you want to do is just click this folder icon here and search for wherever you have your ISO downloaded. So probably your downloads, unless you moved it. Here, as I already said, it's on my desktop. It found it, so I'm just going to click Start, and the virtual machine is going to start to load up. And ladies and gentlemen, we are running a operating system within an operating system. That is so cool. So let it load up, and then I'll walk you through the setup process. So here we are at the Ubuntu installation page here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to click install Ubuntu, and now it's going to be treated as just a regular installation like you would on a physical computer. So I'm not sure if I really want to run through all of this because that might be boring for you guys to watch. So I think I'm actually just going to skip this setup process because I'm pretty sure you guys can take it from here. It's really just a matter of filling out, it's just a matter of installing an operating system like you normally would. For this part here, actually I will mention this. You'll see a couple different options, like for the Ubuntu 18.4, minimal installation, normal installation. Just keep everything default, and remember that if it ever says, like right here, it's going to say erase disk and install Ubuntu, just remember that's totally fine. That's not going to erase your Windows installation or anything like that. All that's basically saying is of the 20 gigabytes that we allocated earlier, 22 gigabytes we allocated earlier, it's going to basically just format that and make sure that that's allocated specifically for Ubuntu. So again, don't worry, it's going to set it up properly for you. You can totally erase disk and install Ubuntu. That's not going to affect your host operating system. So I guess I'll just, look, I'm already here. I might as well just keep going. Click continue. And it's already selected my location, so I'm going to click continue again, and here we just fill out some basic information. Carson, blah blah blah. Click continue, and it looks like it's going to actually start installing all the necessary files and folders. So that's how to install Ubuntu. We'll take a look at Windows next, specifically Windows 7, though Windows 10 installation setup is going to be pretty much the same thing. And then we'll also install Linux Mint for fun, just so you guys have a thorough understanding of what's going on here. So I'll see you guys in a bit. All right, what's going on, folks? So there's been a little bit of a change here. Instead of using Windows 7, I've decided to use Windows 10 to demonstrate VirtualBox here because Windows 10 is the latest OS for Microsoft. It's what's receiving majority of their support and their focus and attention, and it's also a little bit easier to find the ISO. So we're going to use Windows 10, and while that's downloading in the background, I decided to just move on to the Linux Mint portion of this tutorial, and then we'll tackle Windows at the end. So let's get started. So now we're going to take a look at how to set up Linux Mint, and it's actually very similar to Ubuntu. So actually it's pretty much identical. So let's just go ahead and click new, and then we're going to specify a name for this machine, and I'm just going to call it Mint, and you'll notice that it defaults to Linux and the version is Ubuntu, which is fine because that's what Mint is based on. And we're going to click next and allocate some memory. So for here, I'm going to set the memory at about 4 gigabytes again. I'm going to click next. And remember, this is totally fine if you want to allocate more or less. It all depends on what you're using your machine for. Again, I'm going to create a virtual hard disk now and leave it at VDI. And I'm going to make sure that that disk is dynamically allocated so we can kind of change it later if we want to. At this point, I'm just going to allocate about 20 gigabytes or so for this machine. And boom, Mint shows up here. And we can again go into settings and do things such as enable disk encryption if we want to keep that information private, or sort of just make it harder to access. We can also change how much memory we have allocated to this virtual machine, as well as how many CPU cores, and we can also adjust the virtual memory that we have allocated as well. Again, this all depends on what you're doing with your virtual machine. That's why I'm not specifically going through and setting everything and telling you guys to replicate it, because it just depends on what you want to use it for. In this particular instance, I'm actually just going to leave everything default. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to double click Mint. And what's going to happen is it's going to fire up and ask me for a ISO. Now, it's looking at the Ubuntu ISO that we used earlier, but since this is Mint, we don't want to use Ubuntu, we want to use Mint. So we're going to click the folder icon once again and manually select the ISO. And my ISO happens to be saved on my desktop, so I'm going to click the Linux Mint 19 ISO there, and I'm going to click Open. And click start, and it will launch. Alright, so now we are in the Linux Mint virtual machine, so let's go ahead and just make this full screen so it's a little bit easier to see. And what I'm going to do is just click this install Linux Mint disk here, and I'm sorry that the icons are so small. I'll try to make them bigger in Premiere. But we're going to click this and we're going to begin the installation. So it's going to say welcome and basically ask you to select a language. English is fine for me. I'm going to leave the keyboard to English US as well. And it looks like I don't know what's going on here with this big black box, but that's interesting. It'll go away when we reboot it. So install third-party software for graphics and Wi-Fi. Yeah, I'm going to leave that checked and click continue once again. And I believe now it's going to ask us about where we want to install Linux Mint. Yep, so it wants us to basically, it's asking us how do we want to install it. Well, we just want to install it on the 22 gigabytes that we allocated earlier, or however large you made your partition. And remember that erase disk doesn't mean it's going to erase your host operating system like Windows or whatever you're using to host it. No, it's just talking about the partition that you created earlier. So everything's going to be fine if you click erase disk. It's not going to erase your main operating system. So I'm going to click install now, and then it's going to basically, it's going to confirm this here. I think that just talks about swap partition. Just click continue. It's going to find my location, and it can do that because it's connected to the network. And we just need to provide a username and a password to log in. And I'm going to click continue, and then the installation process should begin. Again, I'm not sure what this black box is here, but I have Premiere open as well as OBS, and I'm recording in 4K 60 frames per second, so I think this is probably a memory thing, but it will go away once we reboot it. But yeah, there you go. Once it reboots, you'll have Linux Mint installed, and you'll be good to go. So the next thing we're going to take a look at is how to actually install Windows 10 on a virtual machine, and it's pretty easy to do. So I'll see you guys in a couple minutes. Alright folks, so now we are at the final portion of the video where I show you how to install Windows 10 on your virtual machine, and I'm leaving the clout goggles on for this one. So the first thing you'll need to do is actually download the Windows 10 ISO. I'll leave a link in the description where you can do that. It's very easy. You just download this application here and select ISO, and it'll create the file for you. And while this is being created, we can actually go ahead and just set up the virtual machine on VirtualBox. So what we're going to do is we're going to once again click new, and we're going to go ahead and type Windows 10. And the type and version should adjust accordingly, but if they don't, then feel free to go down to the scroll menu and select the correct version. And now we're going to click next, and we're going to do some memory allocation here. By default, it sets you up with 2 gigabytes. I don't think that's going to be sufficient for Windows 10, so we're going to go ahead and crank that up to, well, let's just say, I don't know, around 8 gigabytes. That's fine. 8 gigabytes will be good. Create a virtual hard disk. Leave that the way it is. VDI sounds good to me. That is just the virtual disk image. And make sure, again, that it is dynamically allocated so we can change it later on if we ever need to. It's recommending 50 gigabytes for this particular installation. I don't really have any objection to that, so let's just say create. And there we go. Windows 10 is now a virtual machine in VirtualBox, but we need to still fire it up and get it installed. Now, before we fire it up, we should probably take a look at the settings and make sure everything looks good here. So under General, everything's fine. I'm going to leave it. Under System, what I am going to do is go to the Processor tab here, and I'm just going to allocate a couple more cores. You'll probably want to do this as well. Now, I happen to have a hexa-core CPU, so I'm going to allocate 4, but you can adjust yours accordingly depending on what you're going to be using your virtual machine for. And then display, well, I'm going to just leave that as is. Storage, we don't have to worry about that or anything else here. So let's go ahead and click OK, and let's actually start this up. So I'm going to right click, start, normal start. You can also just could have clicked that start button up there, and now it just wants an ISO, or in other words, it wants the actual Windows 10 operating system. So I'm going to click this folder icon here, and I'm going to find where I have the Windows 10 ISO, and it's on my desktop here. So I'm just going to select that and then click start. So what should happen now is Windows 10 should fire up, and we should be able to actually create or actually install Windows 10. And it looks like it's working just nicely. So I'm going to pause the video, and then once it gets to the setup process, we'll pick up from there. So here we are at the installation process of the Windows 10 virtual machine. All we're going to do is basically just click next here and install now. And I don't have a key on hand, but I don't think that I will need one. And yeah, this should be pretty straightforward. If you've ever set up Windows 10 before, it's the exact same on VirtualBox. So yeah, it does want a key, but I think I can skip that. I don't have a product key. And now it's going to ask us which kind we want to install. And by the way, I know that this text is really small. I'm sorry, there's just nothing I can do about it. I will try to make it larger in Premiere. I think this has something to do with the 4K resolution and scaling. It's just small by default. But if you can't see what I'm doing, I'm just selecting Windows 10 Pro here and clicking Next. And it's going to take me to the next screen here. I just have to agree to the licensing terms. Yep, so we're going to click Next. And now what we're going to do is click Custom Install and just select it on that partition that we created earlier in VirtualBox. If you'll remember, mine was 50 gigabytes, so there it is there. That looks very familiar. I'm going to click Next, and there we go. It's going to go ahead and install Windows 10 in your virtual machine. And it may reboot a couple times as well. That's totally fine. But once it does, once it's on its final reboot, it'll restart. You'll have Windows 10 installed. So that is going to do it for this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If this video helped you at all, please remember to leave a like, leave a comment in the I was going to say leave a comment in the description below, but that would be very hard for you guys to do. Leave a comment in the comment section. Let me know how I can improve. Let me know what you liked. Let me know what you didn't like. And I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks again for watching.
There's this girl, let's call her Tommy.